You're listening to Cover Your Assets, a podcast that discusses the timely and significant legal issues faced by employers. Kathleen Jennings is an attorney who has over 30 years of experience in advising employers as to their legal responsibilities and has written extensively about employment law in her popular Cover Your Assets blog. If your business has employees, you cannot afford not to have your assets covered.
All right, and welcome to the Cover Your Assets podcast, the employment law podcast, and this is already episode 4. We did take a week off because I was actually in the same zip code as our resident expert. That's going to be your new title right now, resident expert Kathleen Jennings. I'm not even going to call you my sister anymore. I'm just going to call you the resident expert. What do you think of that?
Wow. I like that, Tom. I think that's very flattering. And I have to say, I very much enjoyed having you in the same zip code.
So, but we're back into our prospective zip codes. I'm in New York and Kathleen is in Georgia. And today's topic is, well, I guess it's always a timely one, unfortunately, and it's workplace violence. And over the last couple of years during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of workplaces shift to remote, but there's still plenty of jobs where you have to show up. And I think that it's safe to say that there was a time where really the stereotypical work violence situation was at like a post office. I mean, I know the term, it's almost a pejorative. You really don't hear it used anymore, going postal, which I think on some level is a little bit disrespectful. But there was a period of time where there was a lot of shootings and workplace violence in the postal service for whatever reason. I think we could do a whole show on that. But anyhow, it seems like that.
Or not.
It's like, that is a horrible idea. But where it seems like it has shifted to a place that it kind of makes sense, and that's in the healthcare industry. And I know that you work with some hospitals and healthcare facilities, and they're obviously under a lot of pressure in terms of the pandemic. In your experience so far, have you seen any kind of an uptick as far as in the healthcare sector with regard to workplace violence?
I think what I've seen, Tom, is that there are people who have gotten angry at healthcare workers and at healthcare institutions because COVID restrictions has made it harder in some cases to be with relatives that are sick, particularly sick with COVID. People get very angry about that, and they take it out on the healthcare workers, which is unfortunate because those folks are just trying to help people get better. They have enough stress already. They've been working a lot of hours. And they're just, unfortunately, they're the target there for people that are frustrated and upset with COVID and with COVID restrictions.
Yeah, and I mentioned the postal stereotype at the beginning of the podcast, but and that would be sort of a worker on worker crime. But I was pulling up some statistics and some information with regard to workplace violence, and it really falls into 4 categories. You've got the criminal intent, which would be like what you discussed. If somebody comes in and, well, criminal intent, I assume, would be like a robbery situation. Customer client, which is the healthcare scenario that you're talking about. And I think we've heard of situations on airplanes where people have gotten upset about restrictions, or maybe their flight is delayed, things like that. Then, of course, worker on worker. And then another one that kind of pops up every now and then, which is a personal relationship. So it's interesting. That seems like there's a lot of tentacles, and we've already sort of touched on some of these things. So, for instance, worker on worker, when we had the episode regarding terminating somebody with dignity, I think that as sort of a preventive measure for worker on worker, you really have to be very careful in terms of how you discipline and maybe potentially terminate an employee. Is that an accurate statement?
That's absolutely correct, Tom. And that's one of the reasons why you want to treat people with dignity, because you don't want them to get so angry with their coworkers or with the workplace that they come back and do something rash. We don't want that to happen. I would say what I've seen most often, especially recently, are the domestic situations. Those are the ones that are the most volatile. And those are the ones I don't know the statistics, but I feel like they're probably among the most prevalent because these are domestic abuse situations that tend to spill over into the workplace of the person who is being abused. And like I said, I've actually had 2 of these types of incidents with a client in the last 2 months.
Wow. Now, is that when you say the situation like that with the domestic violence, is it a case where there's a couple that works together and maybe are married and lives together, or is it a situation where the domestic violence, maybe the husband or the wife is coming to the workplace but doesn't actually work there, or is it a combination of both?
It could be either one. The situations that I dealt with involved a domestic partner, not a spouse, but a boyfriend who was coming to the female's workplace and making threats at her or just hanging around outside. And so the employer had to do something because they were concerned that he would injure the domestic partner or injure somebody else if he became frustrated.
What is the employer's responsibility in that case? I mean, is there an employer responsibility? I would assume that if the employer has no idea that there's a domestic violence situation or any harassment going on, there probably wouldn't be any liability there. But if they are made aware of it, what is their responsibility at that point? Or if they become aware of it because of somebody else reporting it?
Well, I think there's certainly a moral duty to take some action to prevent violence from happening in the workplace. There's a legal duty once you are aware of a situation that could result in some sort of injury or harm to someone on your premises. You want to prevent that from happening. So that's a potential personal injury lawsuit that could be filed against you if someone does get hurt. And then OSHA also has actually an entire page on their website devoted to workplace violence mitigation. Although OSHA does not have a specific standard on workplace violence, OSHA will look at a workplace and see if it has taken precautions to mitigate what they consider to be a hazard, and workplace violence is a potential hazard.
Yeah, and I think in those situations, it's not even just the couple that is involved. I mean, if somebody comes and maybe they want to hurt their domestic partner, somebody else could get kind of caught up in that and be injured as well. So, is this something that is addressed in employee manuals where, if you suspect there's some kind of domestic abuse? Because I feel like this in some ways is sort of a gray area, because now what we're talking about is a situation that may be happening outside of their normal work hours, but clearly it's something that could impact what's going on in the workplace.
There are employers that have policies and procedures for employees to report potential threats against their person, and then procedures to follow in case there are threats made against the company or against the particular worker, so that they are prepared in that incident or in the case of an incident. It's not the kind of thing where you want to make it up as you go along. You want to be prepared. You want to know who to contact, have all the numbers for law enforcement accessible and ready, and have the person who is responsible for making those contacts when the threat is communicated so that there's no delay.
And then I guess the other thing, which I think will be a great topic for a future podcast, is the relationships amongst employees. I worked for a company in the 90s that had a very strict policy in terms of dating and having a relationship with one of your coworkers. And I think actually one of my more recent employers, it didn't apply to me because I was married, and actually my spouse worked at the same place I did, but they had a policy where you had to report to HR if a couple was dating. And I always found that to be kind of an interesting policy. And I was wondering what the legality was with that. And if maybe that is because they have those policies to kind of be aware of maybe some potential domestic violence situations, or, I don't know, theft or any of those kinds of things.
Tom, I think those types of policies are meant to prevent potential sexual harassment in the workplace, especially most, if not all, employers will prohibit two people in a relationship they don't want to have one of those people supervising the other person because there's an imbalance of power. And what happens is, or what potentially could happen when that relationship blows up, is that the subordinate employee could then claim, well, I didn't have a choice to get into this. If I didn't date my boss, I was going to be fired. Well, maybe that's not true, probably wasn't true at the time, but in hindsight, they can make that allegation, especially if they're angry at the boss. And now you have a sexual harassment claim.
Yeah, well, I guess that makes sense because the one place that I worked at, it was a restaurant, and it was the managers that were not able to date the employees. So then obviously that would have been a supervisor and employee situation. So one thing we haven't touched on is criminal intent. So I guess what comes to mind is, there's a lot of places that handle cash. I know I've talked about the fact I was in the restaurant industry for a long time, and that was always a very real potential situation. Guy waiting outside the back door to clunk the manager in the head as they were trying to make the deposit for the day's business. But I'm sure there's lots of businesses, even though I don't think we deal with as much cash as we used to, that do still make deposits, and there's other things that would be stolen in a workplace. What is the employer's responsibility as far as protecting the employee from a possible criminal act?
Well, banks come to mind. They're usually a target for criminal acts, people trying to rob banks, although they usually aren't very successful. It's going to be the same type of duty. If you are aware that there's a danger that someone could try to injure one of your employees, and this comes up, I think, probably in the context of pizza delivery people or other delivery people. That's why you have a lot of these delivery people or businesses that say, we don't handle cash. So that would deter someone from trying to rob them. Convenience stores, gas stations, those have a high level of crime directed to them. And so they are supposed to take whatever measures they can to mitigate that, but it's probably impossible to completely prevent people from trying to rob convenience stores or pizza delivery people or things like that. So you want to do what you can to protect your employees. Sometimes it's hard to absolutely 100% prevent someone who has some kind of criminal intent, probably trying to support some sort of drug habit or something like that.
Yeah, I didn't even think about banks. I guess that's really the number one thing that most people would think of as far as, and most banks, I would assume, have policies as far as how to deal with a robbery. I know that actually both of our parents were in the banking industry for a long time, and our father was a manager at a bank that was robbed and lost his job because of it, because it was a setup with the bank teller. But I always think of, the how they were instructed to deal with it. Don't argue, just give the cash, or sometimes give the die pack, or all those types of things. But man, I can only imagine how stressful it must be to be in a situation where somebody's threatening you, and how do you train somebody to just kind of react in a way that makes sense and takes their safety into consideration?
You probably can't unless they're a trained security guard or have law enforcement background or something like that. But I imagine banks probably go through a lot of training in the specific procedures that bank employees should follow. I think really I think I've read somewhere that it's the convenience stores that are number one in terms of violence in the workplace because of crimes and criminals coming in.
Yeah, and it seems like there's just this weird fascination with videos of convenience store workers either reacting to criminals or getting robbed, and it's I don't know, I see them pop up in my feed a lot, and it's almost like that same mentality that they had for the cop show, where they say, oh, this is what real life is like. But man, some of them are very scary situations, and those are low paying jobs typically, so it gets even crazier when you think about it.
I got to question what kind of stuff you're looking at that these things are coming up in your feed, Tom, because I got to tell you, I've never had one of those situations come up in any of my social media feeds.
Well, I will say that my day, I know people think that I just make a living doing this podcast with you. That's the perception out there. But my day gig is as a high school teacher, and I work with middle schoolers and high schoolers, and they watch a lot of these little TikTok videos, and I think they used to have Vines. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore. But yeah, you see a lot. For some reason, they just really love the whole convenience store interaction where the convenience store owner like chucks a glass of soda in the guy's face or all that other stuff. And I'm not saying that I enjoy it, but I do see a lot of them, and that's part of the reason. And in terms of my feed, I don't know. I don't think I belong to any convenience store robbery Facebook groups. Maybe one, maybe two. I don't know. But
yeah, you might want to leave those.
It's a thing. It's a thing. I promise you. It's probably a good thing that you don't know, and maybe not such a great thing that I do know.
Yeah, it's not a thing I want to get into, especially having done criminal defense work. I probably had closer experience with it than most of the people watching these videos.
Yeah, and there's a lot of these drive-through things where they'll have some guy come up and throw a soda in somebody's face and things like that. So I for some reason see a lot of those. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just weird like that.
I have no comment on that.
An attorney with no comment. That is wonderful. But yeah, let's move things along. So
moving things along, Tom, normally during these podcasts, we like to hear about one of your personal experiences that have to do with the topic. Have you had any personal experience with a workplace violence situation?
Well, that right there, my sister, for those listening, used to be a softball pitcher, if I remember correctly. And that was one of the greatest softball pitches ever. So
I was actually a catcher, but thank you very much.
Well, maybe you just studied the pitcher, because that one, you just hung that
Clearly.
one right up for me to hit it out of the park. And yes, I for some reason have had so many jobs over my lifetime that I have managed to have scenarios come up that seem to apply to just about every single topic, good, bad, or indifferent. So in this case, it's kind of a weird story, but what happened was I was working at a not-for-profit agency as a social worker, and I had applied for a transfer of my job, and it was a lateral transfer, but it was doing the same work but closer to home, because I was commuting about 45 minutes to an hour in the position I was in, and a position came up in the same town that I lived in. So I applied for that. I did not get the job. And I made the terrible mistake when my supervisor called me and said, "Would you like to talk about it and tell me what you're really feeling?" And I told her what I was really feeling. And I just said to her, I was upset at the way the situation was handled. Well, fast forward, I don't know, 2 or 3 months down the road, and I was having a conversation with one of our former coworkers at a concert of all places. So there's a lot of loud music going on in the background and everything. And at that time, my relationship with my supervisor had kind of degenerated a little bit, but we had this major audit that was going on, and she was just a little bit on the cranky side. And so my coworker said, "Oh, what's going on at work?" I said, "Well, it's been kind of crazy. I didn't get that promotion. So my boss and I aren't getting along. And, she's been going nuts because of this audit." Now, my former coworker said that I used the term that everybody wants to kill my supervisor. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if I said that, and I may have said it, but if I said it, it would have been more in the context of, we just want to kill this person. Not that I actually wanted to kill them, but they were driving us crazy. So maybe the lesson here, sis, is choose your words carefully, right?
I think that is an important lesson for so many people.
Yes. So it's kind of like if you're going onto the airplane and you go, "Man, I want to kill the pilot." You just don't say that, even if it's just your buddy is the pilot and he's making you mad that day.
Yeah.
So anyhow, so this became a game of telephone as the only way I can really describe it, because this former coworker told her friend, who happened to be friends with another coworker, who got back to my supervisor. So then it got back to me that my supervisor had locked down her office because I had physically threatened to kill her. So I get a phone call from the HR department that says, well, we've learned that there was a threat to the life of your supervisor. And we're just following up on that. And I'm like, I don't remember threatening her life. Well, this person said that you said this on this day, and then this day, and then this day. And I said, listen, dude, that's just crazy. And thankfully, I will say that from the HR department's perspective, he said, you have no history of violence. There's no criminal record. We don't, it doesn't even look like you own a gun as far as even having a permitted gun, which I don't own a gun. And so they kind of dismissed it. But I just thought it was one of the more bizarre scenarios. And I've kind of chalked it up to, my supervisor overreacting a little bit. And also, as I mentioned at the outset of the story, I think it had more to do with kind of the conflict between the two of us that had been festering for 2 or 3 months than her actually perceiving that there was a threat. But as I said, obviously you have to choose your words carefully. And I said, I don't know if I said that we wanted to kill her. I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibilities that I said that. But, I that's about it. I don't know what else to say. You're giving me, see, we're on Zoom and those listening can't see the look that my sister is giving me right now. My big sister, she's just shaking her head going, oh my God, my brother gets into these weird scenarios. So it's up to you. Here's your opportunity to comment on that particular scenario.
Well, as you said, you should choose your words more wisely. I would also add you should choose your friends a little more wisely, since somebody ratted you out to your boss at some point. But I can see from the perspective of the company, if they receive a communication that an employee who they know is a little unhappy because he didn't get the promotion or lateral job that he wanted, then made a comment about killing his supervisor, who he's not really getting along with, that they would need to take that seriously. So I think it was good for them to lock things down and take the allegation seriously. Better to be prepared for the worst and hopefully expect the best, which is what happened once they looked into your background and found out that this was not a legitimate threat. Then everything's fine. But what if they had ignored it and you really were the type of person who would go in and kill your supervisor and they did nothing to stop it? That would be a bad situation. So employers do need to take these types of allegations, these types of threats seriously, because you just never know. Not everybody is a nice guy like you.
Well, it's very nice of you to say that I'm a nice guy. I will say from my perspective and looking at it at the time, I felt that it was an overreaction. And also in many ways, it reflected poorly on me. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that you want on your record. And this was not any kind of firsthand information. It came from this person. It actually came, I think it went through 3 people. So by the time it got back to my supervisor, it had gone from the person I supposedly said the statement to at a Loud Rock concert to her friend to my supervisor, which is, I don't know. It said in the end, it wound up being a fairly minor incident because the lockdown only occurred for a very short period of time. And by the time the information got back to my supervisor, it had been 4 or 5 days since the comment had been made anyway. So I don't know that the lockdown was necessarily that effective. But you've given me a new perspective in that, yes, I should at least say, okay, it's understandable from an employer perspective that the facility needed to be locked down. But it was my understanding it was the supervisor that requested the lockdown and that HR stepped in and eventually said, I think this is a bit of an overreaction.
Well, and again, I think from the perspective of an employer, it is important to take these things seriously. So whether it was the supervisor or HR, it's not the kind of comment that can be dismissed lightly. At a minimum, there needs to be some sort of investigation to determine, was this statement even made? And if so, what was the context? And if they had found out that it was Thom at a loud music concert, just shooting the breeze like Thom does, then perhaps it wouldn't have gotten to the point of lockdown. But again, I can understand why they did what they did, because it could have been a lot worse if you were the kind of guy that was violent.
All right, but as you said, I'm not. The only thing the only thing I would have done was try to kill her with kindness. Well, I can't even say that because I wasn't a real fan of her. She was a horrible supervisor. But that's for another day, right?
I think that the lesson that we've learned from this is that you should never use the word kill in the context of anything or anyone having to do with your job.
All right.
Unless it's killing time. But even then, that could be taken out of context. And so it's one of the things that I like to tell supervisors when I do any kind of HR training is don't put a target on your back. Don't say or do the kinds of things that it's going to make people likely to say, yeah, Thom is the kind of guy that would do that kind of thing. Because I hear him talk about killing his supervisor all the time.
All the time.
You don't want to be that guy.
I'm not that guy. I don't want to be that guy.
Don't be that guy. Don't put a target on your back.
All right. Well, I think that is a wonderful ending point, and as always, it was an interesting one today. I enjoyed it.
I thought they were all interesting.
Oh, well, see, now you're twisting it back like I'm saying they weren't all interesting. But it's always, and the best part is when you get to lecture me like the big sister that you are, because in many ways, and the eyes, if we could just somehow capture the eyes on audio, then I think that we would have the most popular employment law podcast in the universe. But anyway,
Probably.
folks, we'll wrap up with, of course, thanking you for listening. And thanks for, if you have any topics, by all means, send us an email. We'll put that email address over in the show notes. We'll be putting these up about once a week. So we've got plenty of time to address any topic that you think is pertinent. Sharing, giving us reviews, feedback, any of that stuff will absolutely help us grow the podcast. And anything else that you would like to say, my resident expert / sister? I'm going to give you the sister title back because you did lecture me today.
Well, thank you very much. I think that it's a pleasure for us to have this weekly chat so that we can also give people some information about some important topics, but also get to see each other and chat with each other.
That's true. And you get to hear all of the crazy stories of my employment over the last how many years. So,
and I don't know that we'll ever run out of those. So that's a good thing.
I don't know either. All right. Well, excellent. Well, again, thank you very much. We will see you next week on the Cover Your Assets podcast. Thanks for listening.